Welcome, Dr. Epic here. What we're going to discuss in this lecture is one of the most fantastic stories in all of archaeology. Indeed, probably one of the more fantastic stories in all of history. We're going to talk about the Treasure of Priam. And it's a story involving a golden treasure, midnight smuggling across a wine-dark sea, beautiful women, a secret deal between empires, Nazis, a great fortress, and secret museums. All of that is wrapped up in the Treasure of Priam. Now, we left off with the discovery of the Treasure of Priam in 1874. Heinrich Schliemann finds the Treasure of Priam at the base of one of the walls at Troy II. And he thinks, of course, this is the Troy of Homer, which is why he calls the Treasure of Priam, because the king of Troy in the Iliad is, of course, named King Priam. And he recognizes this treasure for what it is. And it's contained in this bronze cauldron with this shield as a lid. It's also contained in a number of these big vases. So what is the treasure itself? The treasure, part of it at any rate, is right up above me. The Treasure of Priam, this is a photograph, I believe it's from the 1930s. This is a photograph of part of the Treasure of Priam. The Treasure of Priam itself consists of roughly 8,000 individual objects of gold, silver, electrum, copper. The most spectacular are there on the left, those diadems known as the Jewels of Helen. These are these feminine diadems that consist of gold objects intricately strung together with metallic thread. But the rest of the treasure contains vases, cups, earrings, pure gold, pure silver. An incredible find. And Schliemann is immediately worried. Because remember, the excavations at Hissarlik are never very secure. He's always worried about corrupt officials, thieves, bandits. So what Schliemann does is he makes the decision to smuggle the treasure out of the country. He rapidly digs the treasure out of the ground and has it stored on a cart and takes a shawl off of Sophie Schliemann, his young wife, and throws the shawl over the cart. Or at least he does in one of the versions of the story that he tells. Throughout his life, Schliemann told 2 or 3 different versions of the story. And some critics who really, really hate Heinrich Schliemann have in fact argued that there is no treasure, that it's just all these different things assembled from all over the place. But most people take Schliemann at his word. It is a single archaeologically known treasure. And he's afraid it's going to get stolen. This is 1874. So he and Schliemann make the decision to smuggle the treasure across the Aegean Sea at midnight. The Aegean Sea that Homer called the wine-dark sea. So they move the treasure under the cover of night to the coast, secretly load it onto a boat, and sail away to Schliemann's home in Athens. Schliemann had built one of the largest houses in Athens. And he sets up the treasure in his house. Indeed, he in fact designates an entire portion of his house as a private museum that is open to the public. And the first known photographs we have of the Treasure of Priam are of the Jewels of Helen being worn by Sophie Schliemann. And that's Sophie Schliemann right there, his young and beautiful Greek wife, wearing treasures that are intensely old. This is the first that the Ottoman Empire hears of the discovery of the treasures of Priam, and they are completely outraged. And in fact, Sophie Schliemann wears them to a dinner party. And in fact, there's actually an Ottoman official at the dinner party. The Ottoman Empire is completely furious. They revoke the permission that Schliemann has to excavate at Hissarlik, and this is, for all intents and purposes, the end of Schliemann's excavations at Hissarlik. He will revisit the site with an intention to begin excavations again in 1890. But that's a story that we'll get to in just a second. But basically, 1874, it is the end of Heinrich Schliemann's excavations at Troy, at the hill of Hissarlik. And Schliemann is okay with this. Schliemann is not terribly upset. In Schliemann's mind, he has demonstrated that Troy exists. He has demonstrated that Troy too was the Troy of Homer. And he has found an incredible treasure that will make him famous for all time. So here's the bigger question. Why is Schliemann not real upset at getting thrown out of the Ottoman Empire? And the answer is that Schliemann is not really interested in information about the past. Schliemann is interested in the objects about the past. He is interested in the art. He is interested in the stuff. He is interested in treasure. He's interested in the objects. He's not interested in the information behind the objects. And this is not archaeology. This is antiquarianism. Antiquarianism is the pursuit of objects, of art, of preciosities, treasures, and all of this is to show personal refinement, personal fame, national glory, or, as often the case, antiquarianism is to display raw imperial power. Antiquarians, like Heinrich Schliemann, are not interested in the information behind the objects. They're just interested in the objects themselves. This is very different from a modern archaeology. Modern scientific archaeology is interested in what objects can say about people in the past. The objects themselves are not that important. It's the information they contain about the ancient people that's important. So, for the next few decades, the Treasure of Priam is kept at Schliemann's house in Athens. It's there from 1874 until his death in 1890. Now, even though he's banned from the Ottoman Empire, Schliemann goes on to excavate a large number of sites throughout Greece, most famously the site of Mycenae, where he discovers this golden death mask above that he, of course, calls the death mask of Agamemnon. And all of these things he puts in his house. In fact, he turns most of his house in Athens into a museum that is open to the public. And there is his house in Athens. This is a modern photograph. For the next 16 years, the Treasure of Priam is on display at the Schliemann house in Athens. But as Schliemann begins to get quite older, he begins to become frail of health, and the end is approaching for Heinrich Schliemann. And Heinrich Schliemann has already made an agreement with the Kingdom of Greece, in which, upon his death, everything that he excavated, most of his fortune, and his house itself, will all be donated to the Greek people. Everything he found in Greece is going to get donated to the Greek people. And Greece just assumes part of the Treasure of Priam is going to come with this. But the Treasure of Priam wasn't discovered in Greece proper, wasn't discovered in modern Greece. And as Heinrich Schliemann ages, he is approached by the German Empire. And the German Empire, the newly formed German Empire, it only forms in the 1870s. The Empire of Germany has struck a secret deal with the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottoman Empire is corrupt, it's broken, it's dying. The Ottoman Empire is now essentially a client state of Imperial Germany. And Imperial Germany forces the Ottomans to make a deal. And the secret deal goes like this. The Ottoman Empire will allow Heinrich Schliemann back to excavate Troy. In return, Heinrich Schliemann is going to put in his will, after his death, the Treasure of Priam will go not to the Ottoman Empire, not to the people of Greece, but to Berlin. It will go to Imperial Germany. Schliemann likes this. Schliemann agrees to the deal. And in the last year of his life, he returns to Hissarlik and he plans an entire new suite of excavations. But unfortunately for Heinrich Schliemann, he dies before any really new major excavations can begin. Schliemann dies in 1890, and as per the conditions of his will, everything he had excavated and kept in his museum in the Schliemann House in Athens becomes the property of the Greek people. Indeed, even his house itself becomes the property of the Greek people. And for many years, it was the Greek National Museum. In fact, I believe it's still part of the Greek museum system even today. I think it's like their stamp museum, last time I checked. But everything goes to the people of Greece, with the exception of the Treasure of Priam. In 1890, the Treasure of Priam is removed from the Schliemann House, moves across Europe, and it occupies its new home at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. And there is on display for the next 53 years. In fact, that's where these photographs are taken. It becomes the centerpiece of the Berlin Museum, and they show off the Treasure of Priam, and it's there. It is considered the crown jewel, the treasure of the Pergamon Museum until the 1940s. Now, I don't know how well you know your European history, but in Europe, especially in Germany, in the 1940s, there was a spot of bother. This was, of course, the Second World War. And if you as an American visited Berlin during that period, this probably would have been your view. World War II breaks out in 1939. Nazi Germany goes to war with half the world. And starting in the 1940s and accelerating up to 1943, both the Americans and the British began heavy aerial bombardment of the city of Berlin. And this is, in fact, a photograph taken from an American bomber assessing bomb damage in the city of Berlin. And the British and the Americans would take turns bombing the city. The British would bomb at night, the Americans would bomb during the day. And I mean, this is the 1940s, so the bombs aren't real accurate. And sometimes they're trying to bomb industrial and military targets, but if a couple planes go astray and take out an entire residential neighborhood or a big section of downtown Germany or the Pergamon Museum, the British and the Americans, especially the British, are okay with that. And Berlin is systematically leveled, bomb by bomb, year by year. The city begins to be reduced to rubble. And the curators of the Pergamon Museum become quite alarmed. They're like, what happens if the museum itself is heavily bombed? What happens if the British or the Americans, and then later the Russians, bomb the museum? We need to remove these treasures from Berlin and place them in some place that's safer. But of course, the Nazis, and Hitler himself countermands this order. He says, no, removing the treasures of Berlin smacks of defeatism. Therefore, the treasures must remain in the city itself. And they have to find a really, really safe place to put the treasures of the Pergamon Museum. And they find it. And it's called the Falk Term Tiergarten. This is the Falk Term Tiergarten. So what is the Falk Term Tiergarten? That's its German name. In English, it's more popularly known as the Berlin Zoo Flak Tower. So what was this flak tower? The most basic definition of the flak tower is that it is an elevated gun platform that enables these massive anti-aircraft guns, you can see them right there, to shoot at bombers that are passing over the city of Berlin without adjacent buildings getting in the way. I mean, if you just put a gun on the street, it wouldn't be able to shoot in half of the directions because there would be buildings on either side of it. But luckily, the place nearest downtown Berlin was the Berlin Zoo. And so in the middle of the zoo, the Nazis build this monstrosity of concrete and steel. The walls were crazy. They were like 5 meters thick, steel and concrete. It was designed to withstand massive aerial bombardment. And it was 6 stories high and 3 stories deep. Safest place in Berlin. And in the basement of the Falk Term is where they place the treasures of the Pergamon Museum. And this has the side benefit of one of the, here's your odd fact of World War II. Whenever these waves of bombers would cross over the city of Berlin, the first wave of bombers would always try to suppress the flak guns. So the first wave of bombers always attempted to bomb the Tiergarten, always attempted to bomb the flak tower, which means one of the most heavily bombed places in the whole of World War II was actually the Berlin Zoo. These devastated, almost all the animals were killed. I think the only survivors were an African egret and a 3-legged hippopotamus named Fritz. At any rate, the flak guns on top of the flak tower would shoot at the bombers, and the bombers would bomb the flak tower, and then they would proceed to bomb the rest of the city. And an indication of just how incredibly tough this building is, the photograph above me is a photograph that's taken not when it's initially constructed. That's a photograph taken after the end of the war, okay? That's after the tower has been bombed dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And they had these massive guns, 128 millimeter anti-aircraft guns on top of this thing, massive. It is the safest place in Berlin. This is a painting from the video game Sniper Elite of the Falk Term Tiergarten in action. It serves no real point in the lecture. It's just a really dope picture. It's just, how can I not use it? It's just awesome. So the Treasure of Priam and the entire collection of the Pergamon Museum is in the basement of the Falk Term for at least 2, maybe 2.5 years. And the Russians take the city in 1945. As a matter of fact, there is a massive tank battle in and around the Berlin Zoo flak tower. The flak tower like depresses those massive guns from the top and shoots at Soviet tanks that are approaching the tower. In fact, there's stories of these guns on top of the flak tower were so powerful. I mean, they were essentially naval guns. That if they hit a Soviet tank on the side, they would actually shoot through the entire tank. So this massive tank battle erupts around the flak tower. And the Russians do not actually capture the tower. They surround it and wait for it to run out of supplies. The commander of the flak tower finally agrees to surrender. And he's going to surrender at midnight. But as soon as the sun sets, he and his men escape to the west and end up surrendering to the west. So they don't have to surrender to the Russians. At any rate, the Russians capture the flak tower in 1945. And they capture the whole of the city of Berlin in 1945. And it's a completely chaotic time. It's a complete mess. They're cleaning up after the war. There's not really a functioning government. The German people are smashed and broken, smashed by war and then brutalized by the Russian occupation. Finally, when the museum curators get into the basement of the Falk Term, they find many of the collections have been gone through. The crates are opened. Treasures of the Pergamon Museum are scattered around the floor. They find it to be an absolute mess. The pumps apparently quit working at one point, and part of the basement had actually filled with water. And as they began to unpack and to see what's there, they can't find the Treasure of Priam. And indeed, the treasure vanishes. It's gone without a trace. The Treasure of Priam vanishes in the chaos at the end of World War II, 1945. No one knows exactly when it vanished, but it vanished. And when I took my version of this course a long time ago, this was the end of the story. That, the Treasure of Priam lost in World War II. Maybe it was melted down by the Nazis. Maybe it was looted by Russian soldiers. Nobody really knew what happened to it. It was just thought, just gone. Another casualty of Nazi Germany in the Second World War. But that's not where the story ends. The story next picks up in 1991, where, here's a phrase you don't hear very often, crusading art history journalists. A pair of crusading Russian art journalists, Konstantin Akinsha and Grigory Kozlov, start breaking a series of stories in a magazine called Art News. And in the 1990s, the Soviet Union, of course, collapses. It's the end of communism in Russia. And Akinsha and Kozlov suddenly start breaking a story on how the Soviet Russias operated a series of special military units called trophy brigades. And these trophy brigades were active between 1943 and 1950. And the point of these trophy brigades was to go through the conquered portions of Eastern and Central Europe, designed to go through the art museums of these conquered countries, to assess the artworks, assess the factories, select the things that are of special merit to the Russian people, confiscate them, and then secretly ship them back to communist museums in Russia. So they would claim these materials and move them to secret sections of these museums in Soviet Russia. And the secret parts of these museums were not open to the public. They were only accessible by top party members of the Communist Party, by the top Communist Party officials. And Akinsha and Kozlov, and these are their books discussing the story that they broke above, ended up tracing the provenience of over 300 old master paintings. All of these paintings thought had been lost in the Second World War, with most of these paintings being stolen by the Nazis from these murdered Jewish families, and then illegally confiscated by the Russians, and then held in secret museums. And these 300 paintings included masterworks, included Monet, Cézanne, Degas, El Greco, Daumier, Courbet, Renoir, Delacroix, and many, many others. Over 300 paintings. And then on one of the invoices from 1945, they discover 3 crates being moved from Berlin to Moscow. And labeled in Russian on this invoice is that this shipment contained Greek vases and gold things removed from Berlin to a secret portion of a museum in Russia. They were delivered to the secret wing of Russia's largest museum, the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. The Russian government, of course, denies this. They completely deny it. They say everything about the story is absolutely false. We do not have 300 paintings. We do not have the Treasure of Priam. But Akinsha and Kozlov had the invoices. They had the shipping manifests. They had the accounts given by veterans from World War II saying, yeah, we moved these paintings. And yeah, we delivered them to the Pushkin Museum. The Russian government denies everything. And so finally, after a few years, the Russian government says, okay, part of the story might be true. So the world went, do you have secret parts? Is there a secret wing of the Pushkin Museum? And Russia went, yes. And everyone wanted to see what was in the secret wing of the Pushkin Museum. And then Russia said it's closed for renovation. And it was closed for renovation for 10 years until 2001, when they finally opened the secret wing, the secret sections of the Pushkin Museum. And there, in the center, the centerpiece of the newly restored parts of the Pushkin Museum was the Treasure of Priam, having been hidden by the communists since the end of World War II. And if you want to go see it today, this is where the treasure of Priam is in the current year, on display in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. Now, this immediately raises a question. Who owns the Treasure of Priam? Immediately after its discovery, Germany, you see up there on the upper left, Germany said, amazing, the Treasure of Priam, long lost, thought to have been destroyed. It can be returned to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. And just as the Germans were celebrating, in comes Turkey. That's our second flag from the left. And the Republic of Turkey intervenes and says, whoa, 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 whoa. Turkey is, of course, the successor to the old Ottoman Empire. And Turkey says, wait a minute. Heinrich Schliemann smuggled out this treasure in 1874. And if it should go anywhere, it should be returned to Turkey, which is, the land where it was discovered. So Turkey claims that Germany's claim is absolutely false and it should be returned to the Republic of Turkey. And just as Turkey is making these complaints, the Republic of Greece intervenes. There's Greece, Greek flag right up above us. Greece says, absolutely not. This should not be returned to Turkey. It was on display in Athens for many years. And the Trojan War and the Treasure of Priam, these are parts of Greek history. It is not part of Turkish history. After all, the Turks are, in terms of the Middle East and that part of the Mediterranean, the Turks only arrived there in the late Middle Ages. In fact, almost all of what is modern-day Turkey used to be the eastern half of Greece. Then it was conquered by the Turks. So Greece said, no. It's not part of ancient Turkish history. It's part of ancient Greek history. We are the descendant community of the Trojan War. It belongs to Athens and the Greek people. And then Russia, that's Russia in the upper right. Russia. Russia says absolutely not. Russia claims the Treasure of Priam is reparations for the destruction visited upon Mother Russia by Nazi Germany in the Second World War. After all, Nazi Germany killed millions and millions of Russians, blew up entire museums, strip-mined the Russian homeland for anything it could produce. Russia says, no, we are owed the Treasure of Priam for the millions of Russians who died to defeat Nazi Germany. It is ours. So here is my question to you. Who owns the past? Who has a moral claim on the Treasure of Priam? Is it the Germans? They're the people that Schliemann willed it to originally in 1890. Is it the Turks? Well, it was found at Hissarlik in 1874. And Hissarlik is in modern Turkey. Is it the Greeks? Because after all, the Treasure of Priam is part of Greek history, and it was on display in Athens when Schliemann was alive. Or is it Russia? Are they owed reparations from World War II? And they rightfully own the treasure. Who owns the Treasure of Priam? Who owns the past? And more importantly, what do you think a modern scientific archaeology argues about the ownership of the Treasure of Priam? Okay, we're going to return to Hissarlik itself. Above me is a photograph of Hissarlik as Heinrich Schliemann left it, as he took it from this nice, leveled off hill to what looks like today a half-melted blob of Swiss cheese. Heinrich Schliemann's brutal excavations left Hissarlik utterly smashed. And Schliemann never backfilled his excavations. He never had a designated dump area. Often he would dig in one part of the site, and the material he removed from that part of the site, he would just dump on another part of the site. Much of Troy itself is very, very difficult to investigate archaeologically. So here's my question to you. Why did Schliemann dig this way? Why did Schliemann just tear through this site and not really care about detailed maps or really detailed photographs? Why didn't he care? Why didn't he produce these drawings and photographs like other archaeologists of his day were doing? That's a question you'll have to answer. And if you go to Hissarlik, and if you go there today, this is what the city looks like. This devastated, half-melted blob of Swiss cheese. But can you actually do archaeology there, even though Schliemann totally tore through the city of Hissarlik, the site of Hissarlik? And is it really even the ancient city of Troy? Now, I've told you all about the Treasure of Priam, all about Antiquarianism. So here is the question. Do you have enough information to answer the question on the left, that question right there? Based on Schliemann's excavation, can you prove that Hissarlik was Troy? Can you answer the question, what was the Treasure of Priam? Did the Trojan War actually happen? What is the relationship between the treasure and the Trojan War? And what does the scientific archaeology say about ancient Troy? What exactly was the treasure in antiquity? And what did it mean to the ancient Trojans? And then finally, what does the treasure mean to modern archaeology? Can you answer that question? Because that's the question we'll address in the next section. And I will see you there.